There. The United Nations annual climate summit is currently being held in South Africa and it's just reached its halfway point.
Opposition spokesman for Climate Action, Environment and Heritage, Greg Hunt, is calling on the federal government to use the conference to champion industry or sector-based agreements over a carbon tax. He joins us now in the studio. Greg Hunt, good morning.
Good morning.
Well, we have the carbon tax, but tell us about what you'd like to see emerge from this conference in terms of those more sort of industry-sponsored changes. What do you mean by that?
Sure. The ideal would be a global treaty. That would be critical for Australia. That is not likely to happen. So in the interim, what we're looking for is sectoral agreements. Now, what does that mean? It means that you take a sector such as steel or cement or methanol and you try to get a common approach across the globe. You won't get 100%, but you might be able to get 80%, and that's a way to get over the issue of boundaries and borders, which has been a huge barrier to international action. So rather than trying to imagine a treaty into being which isn't going to occur, and that means that the government's modelling will collapse because it's based on the best of all possible worlds, we should try to work in the real world and build up a practical action from the bottom up right now.
How would those sectoral agreements work in practice?
What you'd be looking for is an agreement across, it could be China and India, the United States and Canada, Australia, in, say, for example, the cement sector, to look at an emissions reduction average. It might be 10% by 2015 for that particular sector. So you're trying to look at tangible actions in identifiable sectors across countries, and that gets over the problem of one country acting and another country not acting, which has been a huge barrier where you're looking at this big bang global treaty.
The trouble with those industries, just staying with the cement one for example, is that they're all going to be run so differently country to country. There's also going to be a different kind of taxation and maybe even subsidy regime as well when it comes country to country, particularly if you're talking about China. So getting some sort of uniformity on that would be a huge challenge.
Well, that is the same problem writ massively larger if you're looking for a global treaty. What you can do is you can look at percentage reductions in specific industries, rather than having to have
within that country itself, sort of
comparison
to comparison.
What is the percentage reduction for China, the percentage reduction in cement for Australia? It's about trying to do practical and real things and not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. What's happened here is that the government has assumed that the world will have a treaty and the world will have a comparable system to Australia by 2016. Clearly that's a fantastic, impossible assumption, and therefore the modelling collapses, and after Durban they'll have to redo it. But in the meantime, let's try to work on practical things. We're proposing in a constructive fashion this notion of industry agreements, or what are in the trade called sectoral agreements, practical outcomes, and when they come back from Durban, obviously they'll have to redo the modelling.
We have news from Durban that the Climate Change Minister, Greg Combet, has announced he's moving to hitch up Australia's emissions trading scheme with the one in New Zealand and the European Union one, which of course is the world's biggest at the moment. That's surely a positive step towards a global agreement.
Well, unfortunately it's not news. This has been repeated on multiple occasions. What is news overnight is that the United States has apparently started to freeze Australia out of negotiations. And the reason why is the US wants to defer a global treaty to 2020, with any talks deferred until 2015. That is so far removed from the assumptions that are at the heart of the carbon tax modelling that it's extraordinary. And what that means is that Australians end up paying higher electricity prices than was assumed by the government. The Centre for International Economics said that if that sort of scenario occurs, the price rise would be 30%, not 10%, and that's why this system, unfortunately, is collapsing before our very eyes.
I just want to change gears for a moment before we let you go, ask you the opposition's response to the government's announcement last night that the Australia network tender and the contract stays permanently with the ABC.
Well, I actually like the job that the ABC does on this, but on the process that the government undertook, I think, unfortunately, the process has been a sham. I hope that there has been no political payback for perceived political positions in some of the News Limited newspapers. And obviously we'll have to look at the process. I think that there ought to be a Senate inquiry at the very least into the process. But
there's already two inquiries going. Yeah. You'd add a third to that?
Well, let me just say this. I like the job the ABC does. I don't like the job that the government does. I think whether it's in existing inquiries or as a separate inquiry, they're going to have to look at this process because clearly it's been manipulated on a political basis, not on a qualitative basis.
Just one broader political question as well. That yesterday's news poll, good for the coalition generally on the two-party preferred basis, but pretty bad for Tony Abbott with his approval rating falling. Does the coalition have to recalibrate tactics moving into next year should the opposition go from being essentially negative, which has been brutally politically effective this year, to offering something different to preserve its approach next year? Look,
I think we've had a tremendously effective year in exposing the government as essentially not thinking things through and pretending that the best case scenario will always occur, whether it was home insulation, whether it was green loans, whether it's the carbon tax, or just each year's budget figures, which inevitably blow out because they have impossible assumptions going forwards. Our task in the coming year is to be both critic of the government but also to be the alternative government. We are moving into that phase of being the alternative government. A national economic recovery plan, looking at a community development plan, a national environment plan. These are the great building blocks for an alternative government, and that's the additional phase which we'll be adding as we go forward in the next year.
Greg Hunt, good to talk to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, and good luck with bigger things coming forward.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Certainly much bigger. You are watching ABC News Breakfast, and these are our top stories.